The call came in at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning, and Weston Keller was already awake when it did. He had been sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with his second coffee going cold beside him, the way he had been sitting most mornings for the past several months. Not insomnia, exactly, more the particular inability to stay unconscious that comes from a career built on anticipating problems before they announce themselves. 22 years in rail operations management had rewired something in his nervous system that no amount of vacation or reasonable sleep hygiene had managed to put back the way it was. He woke before dawn. He sat in the dark. He waited for the phone. It was not a conscious vigil. He did not sit there thinking about work or rehearsing scenarios or preparing himself for whatever the morning might produce. He simply sat the way a person sits when the body has forgotten how to fully rest, with the coffee in the dark kitchen and the particular silence of a house in the hour before the world starts making noise again. His wife had commented on it once gently in the early years of their marriage, this habit of rising before the alarm, of being already awake and already somewhere else in his mind when she came downstairs. He had not been able to explain it to her then. He was not sure he could explain it better now. When it rang, he picked it up on the first tone. The voice on the other end belonged to Gary Holden, the overnight dispatch supervisor at the regional depot, and the quality of his voice flat and careful. The voice of a man who has already decided how to say something difficult and is now just saying it told Weston everything he needed to know before the words did. Locomotive 983, mile marker 47, Old Rocky Pass line. Not derailed, not damaged, just stopped. Weston was in his truck with his boots still unlaced before the call ended. The drive to Rocky Pass took 40 minutes in the dark up through the lower canyon, and then the long climbing switchbacks that eventually leveled out onto the high plateau where the old rail line cut through the timber country and the mountains pressed in close on both sides. It was a drive Weston had made enough times over the years that his hands knew the turns without consulting his attention, which left his mind free to do what it always did in the dark on the way to an emergency work through what was known, what was probable, and what the morning was likely to require. What was known, Locomotive 983, a Union Pacific freight hauler, had stopped at mile marker 47 on the Rocky Pass line under circumstances that dispatch had described as a mechanical lockup rather than a derailment. The train was carrying 4,200 tons of industrial cargo bound for a major construction project in Portland. $23 million of material. 11 days to delivery deadline. What was probable, a seized axle or a brake malfunction that had locked the wheel assemblies, or some combination of mechanical failure and environmental condition that had come together at the worst possible moment on a remote mountain grade. These things happen. They happen less than they used to because the equipment was better and the monitoring systems were better, but they happened, and when they did, they happened in places like mile marker 47, where access was difficult and the margin for delay was narrow, and the chain of people who needed to be called was long. What the morning was likely to require clear thinking, decisive action, and the particular kind of calm that a person either has in a crisis or does not, in which no amount of professional preparation can fully manufacture if it is not there to begin with. Weston had been told by enough people over enough years that he had this quality that he had come to accept it as simply part of what he was like being left-handed or having a good memory for names. It was not a virtue he had cultivated. It was a disposition he had been given, and he had built a career on it, and he hoped it was still intact this morning because the tone of Holden's voice on the phone had suggested that he was going to need it. The regional director, Alan Pierce, had called twice before Weston reached the access road. He had let both calls go to voicemail. He would return them when he had something worth saying, and he did not yet have anything worth saying. Pierce was a man who managed by information, who needed the shape of a situation before he could position himself relative to it, and giving him half a picture before the full picture was available was a reliable way to create additional problems rather than solve the existing ones. Weston had learned this early in his time under Pierce's supervision and had applied the lesson consistently ever since. By the time he pulled his truck off Route 9 and onto the gravel access road leading to the staging area, the sun was still just a pale suggestion behind the eastern ridge of the Rockies, the kind of thin, reluctant light that exists before the day commits to itself, the kind that makes everything look more uncertain than it probably is. Weston had always disliked this particular quality of early light. It had no honesty in it. What he found at mile marker 47 stopped him at the edge of the gravel before he had finished climbing out of the truck. Locomotive 983 sat on the track exactly as described. A Union Pacific freight hauler nearly 300 feet from engine nose to the last coupled car, sitting on the rails with the complete and absolute stillness of something that had decided it was done moving. She was not derailed. She was not overturned or visibly damaged in any way that could be assessed from the gravel access road. She simply sat there in the early mountain light like a geological feature, like something that had always been there and had no particular interest in being anywhere else. The scale of her was the first thing. You knew intellectually working in this business how large these trains were, how much they weighed, what the numbers represented in practical terms. But knowing the numbers and standing 40 feet from a stopped 4,000-ton freight hauler on a mountain grade in the early morning were two different experiences, and the second one always made the first one feel somewhat theoretical. Weston stood at the edge of the gravel access road for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the locomotive with the focused attention of a man assessing something he does not yet fully understand. Then he walked toward it. Cody Mercer met him at the engine. Nose. Mercer was a lean young man in his early 30s who had come up from the Harmon Industrial Depot in the dark, and he already had a shop rag in his hands, already black with grease, and the expression of someone who has tried the obvious things and found them insufficient. He had a quality that Weston had noticed in him before and valued an honest face that did not try to make bad news look better than it was. Some people in his position would have managed the presentation. Mercer just told you what was there. Drive axle locked up, Mercer said. He wiped his hands with the efficiency of a man who has been wiping them all morning and expects to continue. Seas clean through. We're not getting her rolling under her own power. We need heavy recovery equipment just to move her enough to assess the full damage picture. Weston looked at the front wheel assembly, then at the track, then at the embankment on the east side where the soil had a dark, saturated quality that spoke of recent and heavy rain. When did it happen? Dispatch says she was running normal at mile marker 52 at 4:40. By the time the signal dropped at 47, she was already stopped. Best guess is she locked up somewhere in the grade between those 2 points and rolled to a stop here under her own weight. Anyone hurt? Engineer got off clean, called it in from the trackside and waited for us. Mercer nodded toward a figure sitting in a camp chair near one of the depot trucks. A middle-aged man in a Union Pacific vest with a paper coffee cup held in both hands, staring at nothing in particular with the expression of someone who has been replaying a sequence of events for the past 2 hours and has not yet found the point where he could have done something different. He's fine. Shaken, but fine. Says he felt the axle go and had maybe 3 seconds before the braking effect brought her to a stop. Nothing he could have done. Has he given a full statement? To Holden on the phone. I've got the basic details. He'll need to go through the formal process when this is resolved. Weston looked at the engineer for another moment. Then he looked back at the locomotive. The chain of calls that needed to happen was already assembling itself in his mind. Harmon Industrial, first because recovery equipment was the immediate need, and then the Portland project manager, and then Pierce in that order, with the information increasing in substance as the morning developed. He pulled out his phone and made the call to Harmon Industrial. Within 2 hours, the mountain road was transformed. Harmon Industrial Towing was the largest commercial recovery operation in the Pacific Northwest, a company that had been built over 3 decades on a simple and consistently validated premise that no load was too heavy and no situation too complicated, provided you had the right equipment and the institutional will to deploy it. Their fleet of recovery vehicles was the finest that money and accumulated specialized knowledge could produce bright yellow heavy-duty rigs that had been engineered for exactly this category of problem machines that carried their own reputation in their paint and their design and the way their operators stepped out of them when they arrived at a scene. The convoy arrived in 3 waves, each more substantial than the last, the mountain road filling up with yellow, and the smell of diesel, and the particular organized competence of professional people who know what they are doing and expect to proceed without interruption. The second wave brought the large hydraulic winch rigs. The third wave brought the crane support vehicles and the supplementary chain equipment and the mobile operations unit that served as Dixon's command center when the job was too large for a single staging point. The operations lead contractor stepped out of the first vehicle with the ease of a man for whom arriving at a crisis is simply another kind of entrance. His name was Harley Dixon, and he was the kind of man whose professional reputation had become indistinguishable from his personal identity over 22 years of doing the same work extremely well. Broad through the shoulders, deliberate in his movements, with the particular manner of someone who had been told he was the best at what he did often enough and early enough that the information had become not arrogance exactly, but a kind of structural assumption, the foundation of every decision he made, rather than something he thought about. He wore his company vest like a uniform. He surveyed the scene with the calm, proprietary attention of a surgeon viewing a patient whose diagnosis he has already formed from the referral notes. He walked the full length of the locomotive, once slowly looking at the wheel assemblies, in the track, in the embankment, with the thorough eye of experience. He crouched at the front axle for 20 seconds. He stood and looked at the east embankment. He looked at the sky as though consulting the weather's intentions. Then he came back to where Weston was standing and gave him the slight, assured nod of someone who has confirmed what he already knew. "Give us 90 minutes, Dixon said. "We've moved heavier things than this." He said it with the quiet confidence of a man who is not boasting, but simply reporting a relevant fact, and Weston, who had worked with Harmon on 3 previous recovery operations and had seen Dixon deliver on exactly this kind of promise, found nothing in the statement to doubt. 90 minutes came and went. The chains went taut and snapped. The first set had been rated for loads well beyond what locomotive 983 represented on paper. And the snap had come not from the chain exceeding its rating, but from the dynamics of the pull, the angle of engagement, the microgeometry of the wheel-to-rail contact, the way the bound wheel assemblies redirected force in ways that the static load rating did not account for. Dixon brought in heavier chain. It held longer, then gave way in a different location. The hydraulic winches groaned through their load cycles and gave out one after another, the hydraulic fluid temperatures climbing past operational limits as the systems worked against a resistance that did not yield. One of Harmon's specialized rigs, a piece of equipment that Dixon had once described to a trade publication as capable of moving anything that could fit on a standard rail gauge, cracked a reinforced steel tow bar while trying to move locomotive 983 a single measurable inch. The crack had been audible from 50 yards, a sound like a rifle shot in the mountain air, sharp and definitive, and it was followed by a silence that had a different quality than the silence before it. The silence before it had been tense, the silence of people expecting a result. The silence after was the silence of people recalibrating. Dixon stood at the front of the locomotive for a long moment after the tow bar cracked. He stood with his hands on his hips and his jaw set and his eyes moving across the scene with an expression that Weston had not seen on him before. Not defeat, not yet, but the early stages of something that would become defeat if it was not intercepted by a new idea, and the new ideas were not arriving. He brought in a second convoy. He brought in a third. Industrial cranes arrived from a facility 40 miles south, their operators professional and efficient, and carrying their own quiet confidence that proved equally insufficient. 2 heavy lift rigs came on flatbed trailers in the early afternoon, their specifications impressive enough on paper that a small, cautious optimism had circulated briefly through the staging area before those attempts failed as well. By midday, there were 19 recovery vehicles staged along Route 919, of the most capable machines of their kind available anywhere in the region, and the mountain air above the staging area smelled like burnt rubber and hot metal, and the particular acrid combination that comes from mechanical systems pushed past what they were designed to do. The sound of machinery under impossible strain had become a kind of background texture to the day, familiar and dispiriting, the sound of a problem that was not responding to the solutions being offered. Not one of them had moved locomotive 983 a single foot. The locomotive sat exactly where it had sat at 6:14 that morning, in the exact same position, utterly indifferent to 19 vehicles and 6 hours of organized professional effort. The chain marks on its front coupling assembly and the torn ground around the wheel assemblies were the only physical evidence that anything had been attempted at all. Weston was on his 4th call with the Portland project manager, a man named Stephen Rourke, whose professional calm was becoming incrementally more difficult to maintain as the morning turned into afternoon, when Dr. Sandra Weaver arrived from Denver. She had been flown in specifically at Pierce's authorization during the 2nd hour, because the situation had already by then exceeded the standard recovery protocols and the kind of expertise that Harmon's operational team represented. Dr. Weaver was a structural engineer with a specialization in heavy rail recovery, a narrow enough field that there were perhaps a dozen people in the country who could be said to hold it at her level, and she was generally regarded as the most practically capable of those dozen. She had published work on exactly the physics that Weston was watching fail in real time on a Montana mountain grade. She had been called on by 3 different railroads in the past decade to assess situations that had already defeated the standard responses. She was a woman in her mid-50s with precise and careful intelligence and the manner of someone who does not offer comfort they cannot support with data. She arrived in a rental car, changed into work boots, at the staging area, without making any particular point of it, declined Weston's offer of a briefing in favor of simply walking the scene herself, and spent the next 45 minutes conducting what was clearly a thorough and systematic assessment without addressing a word to anyone present. She walked the full length of the train twice. She crouched at 7 separate points along the wheel assemblies, not just the front axle, but distributed across the length of the train, taking measurements and making notes. She spent a significant amount of time at the east embankment, pressing her hand into the soil at 4 different points, photographing the ground at close range, examining the relationship between the ballast stone and the underlying soil, with the focused attention of someone whose expertise includes understanding what rain does to mountain grades over 48 hours. She photographed the railhead contact surface at the locked wheel assembly with a camera she produced from her bag, shooting from multiple angles with a methodical patience that suggested she was building a complete visual record rather than looking for a single confirming image. Then she came back to where Weston and Dixon were standing at the front of the locomotive, and she delivered her conclusion with the flat, careful precision of someone who has checked her work twice and found it consistent both times and is now simply reporting what is true. "The problem is the ground," she said. She turned the tablet toward them briefly, not long enough for either of them to read the numbers, just long enough to indicate that the numbers existed and were the source of what she was about to say. "The rainfall 2 days ago saturated the soil beneath the ballast along approximately 60 feet of this grade. Combined with the seized axle and the weight distribution across 32 loaded cars, the train has settled into what I would describe as a structural lock condition. The wheel flanges have micro-embedded into the railhead surface under the compression of the train's own weight. The contact is not purely mechanical. It involves the deformation of both the wheel flange and the rail surface under sustained load, and the saturated subballast has allowed the entire system to settle in a way that reinforces the contact rather than releasing it." She paused, looking at her tablet for a moment. "Every time you apply pulling force in the conventional direction, directly opposing the direction of travel, or lateral to it, you increase the binding pressure at the embedded contact points. You are not loosening the contact. You are deepening it. Each attempt increases the lock." Dixon's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, but Weston, who had been watching Dixon's face all day, caught it. "So what are you recommending?" Dixon asked. His voice was even professionally controlled, but the evenness itself carried a quality that had not been there in the morning. "Partial unloading of the rear cars," she said. "You reduce the total compression load on the wheel assemblies progressively, which may allow conventional recovery equipment to break the contact point once the overall compression falls below a certain threshold. The unloading operation requires crane capacity on the side of a mountain with inadequate access road width for the equipment I would specify. The nearest suitable crane facility is in Billings." She looked at her tablet again. "We are looking at 3 to 5 days minimum from the point of equipment arrival, assuming weather holds, and the access road can be adequately reinforced. Cargo damage risk during unloading under open field conditions on this grade could conservatively exceed $2 million. The silence that followed had a particular texture, not the silence of people thinking exactly, but the silence of people absorbing something that has just changed the shape of the problem they thought they were solving. The shape of the problem they had woken up with this morning had been, how do we move this train? The shape of the problem now was, how do we tell $23 million worth of cargo that it is spending the next 3 to 5 days on the side of a mountain in Montana? Weston looked at the locomotive. He thought about Pierce's voicemails, both of them. He thought about the December performance review, which had been described to him 6 months ago by Pierce as a formality, a word that Pierce used to indicate outcomes he considered already determined. He thought about the Portland project manager on the other end of his most recent call, a man who was currently telling his own superiors something that required its own kind of careful framing. He thought 3 to 5 days. He let the number sit in him for a moment fully, and without resistance, the way you let a diagnosis sit before you decide what to do about it. That was when he noticed the old man. He could not have said exactly when the old man had arrived or how long he had been standing there. He had been present for a while that became clear in retrospect, the kind of thing that is obvious once you see it, but that had been invisible while your attention was elsewhere. He was standing perhaps 30 yards back from the nearest orange safety cone, just at the place where the gravel of the access road gave way to the mountain ground, and the tree line began standing there with the particular stillness of someone who had not moved in some time and was not planning to the way a fence post stands in the middle of a working field that everyone moves around without acknowledging. He was not wearing a hard hat. He was not wearing a high-visibility vest or carrying a radio or a clipboard or any instrument or credential that would have identified him as belonging to the scene in any professional capacity. He was wearing a worn canvas work jacket, the kind that has been through enough washings to forget what color it started as, and has arrived at a color that is simply itself the color of something that has been worn and used for a long time, and his hands were in the jacket's pockets. He was wearing work boots that were old and well-maintained in the way that old tools are maintained by people who understand that the maintenance is the point. He was somewhere in his late 70s, possibly older, short and lean with a face that had the quality of weathered hardwood. Not old in the diminished sense, not the kind of old that suggests something reduced from what it was, but old in the way of things that have been exposed to weather and work and years for a long time, and have simply become more fully themselves in the process, all the unnecessary material worn away, until only the essential remained. His hair was white and close cut. His cheekbones were prominent, and his jaw was still defined. His hands visible where they rested at the pocket openings were the hands of someone who had worked with them for a long time, large-knuckled, steady the hands of a person whose relationship with physical work was old and settled and required no particular thought. His eyes were the pale gray of winter sky at altitude, the specific gray that exists above 8,000 feet on clear, cold days, when the blue has been leached out by the cold, and they were moving across the scene with a slow, deliberate, completely unhurried attention that had absolutely nothing in common with the curiosity of a bystander who has stopped to watch something interesting happen. He was not looking at the recovery vehicles. He was not watching the crew or the activity around the locomotive. He was looking at the locomotive itself, at the track, at the east embankment, where the soil had saturated, and at the wheel assemblies at the front of the train, and he was looking at these things in the focused, assembled way of someone who is not discovering a problem, but confirming a diagnosis they have already made from a distance. Weston almost let him alone. He had a structural engineer's report and a logistics crisis and a regional director with 2 unanswered voicemails, and the Portland project manager waiting on a callback and the particular weight of 19 failed recovery vehicles behind him. The old man standing at the tree line was by any reasonable professional measure not a priority. But something in the quality of that looking stopped him. It was not the looking of someone who was confused or alarmed or simply watching an interesting scene unfold. It was the looking of someone who understood what they were seeing and who had perhaps understood it for longer than anyone in the staging area had been trying to address it. It was the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who know something, and Weston had been in this business long enough to recognize that quality when it appeared even in unexpected places. He walked over. "Sir," he said, approaching carefully with the particular tone he used for situations that required both authority and care. "This is an active recovery zone. I need to ask you to move back behind the perimeter markers." The old man did not move immediately. He kept his eyes on the train for another long moment, unhurried, apparently completing a thought, and then turned to look at Weston with a directness that was neither aggressive nor particularly welcoming. It was simply direct, the unadorned directness of someone who looks at things they are assessing and looks at them fully. "You've got 19 vehicles out here," the old man said. His voice was quiet in the way that voices become quiet after decades of not needing to be raised, not soft exactly, but low, with a quality of compression in it like something that has been reduced to its essential weight. All of them pulling, none of them thinking. He paused. He looked back at the locomotive. You're using the wrong kind of force. That train doesn't need more power behind it. He was still for a moment, his eyes on the wheel assembly. It needs something else entirely. Weston frowned. And what would that be? The old man looked at him for a moment with those pale gray eyes, steady without urgency, the eyes of a man who has given answers before and learned through experience that an answer given before the listener is ready to receive, it is not really an answer at all. Then he turned and began walking slowly back toward the road. His hands were still in his pockets. He did not hurry. Sir, Weston called after him. The old man kept walking. Weston stood there for 3 full seconds. The weight of everything behind him, the 19 vehicles, the failed equipment, the engineer's report, the voicemails, the Portland deadline was substantial and specific and entirely real. He had every professional reason to turn back to the problems he understood how to address. He walked after the old man. Hold on a moment. The old man stopped but did not turn immediately. He stood at the edge of the gravel road, looking toward the trees as though completing a private assessment. Then he turned slowly. Weston stopped a few feet from him. The morning light had shifted while they had all been working. What had been pale and uncommitted in the early hours had become the sharp, direct light of full morning. The shadows short and clearly defined the mountains fully visible in all directions. What did you mean back there? Weston asked. Wrong kind of force. What does that actually mean in this situation? The old man studied him for a moment with the unhurried attention of someone determining whether a question is worth a real answer. Whatever he found in Weston's face apparently satisfied him. Every machine has a nature, he said. You work with that nature, you get results. You fight against it, you crack tow bars and burn out winches. He glanced toward the yellow convoy, then back at Weston. Those rigs are built for straight pull. Clean ground, clean load, clean resistance. They do exactly what they were built to do, and they do it extremely well, and what they were built to do is not what this situation requires. He paused, and something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not quite impatience, more the mild frustration of someone trying to translate something precise into imprecise language. That train has settled. The wheel lock needs rhythm, not force. It needs load applied gradually in a pattern. The metal can respond to the way you work a stuck drawer, not yanked coaxed. The difference is not about the quantity of the force. It's about the nature of it. It's about understanding what you are actually dealing with before you decide how to deal with it. Weston looked at him. And you know how to do that. I know a machine that does. The old man looked back up Route 9 toward where the road curved and disappeared into the timber. I've got a 1908 steam traction engine in a barn about 4 miles from here. Been sitting under canvas for 31 years. But she still runs. The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds. Then Harley Dixon, who had walked over without anyone noticing him, due to a habit he had of appearing at the edges of conversations that might be relevant to him, let out a short sound that was not quite a laugh, but carried all the dismissal of one. He looked at Weston with raised eyebrows in the expression of a man who has been working since dawn and is not particularly interested in what comes next. You're serious, Dixon said. It was not quite a question. A steam engine from 1908 is going to move what 19 of my rigs couldn't. He shook his head, not meanly, but with the complete and easy absence of doubt that belongs to people whose certainty has never been adequately challenged. That thing would be lucky to pull a loaded hay wagon up a mile grade without coming apart. One of the Harmon crew members standing nearby made a quiet sound of agreement. Dr. Weaver, who had drifted over during the exchange, did not smile, but she pressed her lips together in a way that communicated the same position without requiring words. The old man did not react to any of it. He simply waited in the specific, patient way of someone who has been in this kind of moment before, who has stood at the edge of this precise species of institutional certainty before, and who learned long ago that arguing with it is a use of energy that belongs to other people. What's your name? Weston asked. Earl Briggs. Mr. Briggs. Weston paused, organizing what he needed to know. Have you worked in rail recovery before? Not recovery, operations. Earl looked at the locomotive with that same careful assembled attention, the look that saw through the surface of the thing to whatever it was that he understood about it. I ran steam engines on this line for 19 years. Started in 1959, retired in 1978. I know this grade. I know how this track behaves after heavy rain, and I know what that wheel lock looks like from here. I've seen it 4 times before on this exact line. And the other times, we moved the train 3 of the 4. He paused. The 4th time, we got it wrong and made it worse. I know the difference between those two outcomes because I've produced both of them. That's how that kind of knowledge gets built. Weston was quiet for a moment. 19 years on this exact line ending in 1978. That was not a hobbyist's knowledge or a peripheral acquaintance with the subject. That was the kind of knowledge that gets built into a person the way a language gets built in, not learned so much as inhabited, absorbed through years of daily practice until it stops being something you know and becomes something you simply are. Your engine has been sitting for 31 years, Weston said carefully. How confident are you that she'll actually start? Earl was quiet for a moment that felt different from his other pauses. It was the quiet of a man choosing his words with a particular kind of honesty, not performing certainty, and not managing doubt, just finding the most accurate statement of what was actually true. She'll need preparation, he said. 4 hours, maybe a little more. I'll need a hand or two, someone who can follow direction and work carefully. He met Weston's eyes directly. But yes, she'll start. Dixon shook his head with the slow, deliberate movement of a man indicating a position he considers already settled. Keller, we've got a full staged operation here. We've got resources coming from Billings. We don't need to. Your staged operation has tried for 6 hours, Earl said. His voice did not change in volume or tone. There was no sharpness in it, no quality of challenge or confrontation. But there was a quality of completeness, the tone of someone stating what is factually true and finding no reason to soften it or elaborate on it because the fact is the entire point. He turned to look at Dixon for the first time in the conversation directly with those pale gray eyes and held the look for a moment. You've broken equipment that was not designed to break under these loads. You've increased the wheel lock by approximately 30% based on what I can observe from here. Your structural engineer has told you this will require 3 to 5 more days minimum with significant additional cargo risk that could exceed $2 million. He looked back at Weston. I am asking for 4 hours. If it doesn't work, you've lost nothing you hadn't already lost. Weston looked at the locomotive. He looked at Dr. Weaver, who met his glance with a small, deliberate movement of her shoulders, not endorsement, but the unmistakable signal of a person who has exhausted her own alternatives and is not in a position to object to someone else attempting theirs. He looked at Dixon, who had turned to look at his trucks with the jaw-set expression of a man who disagrees but has, at least for the moment, run out of the specific category of argument the situation requires. He looked at Earl Briggs, who simply waited. 4 hours, Weston said. Show me the engine. The barn sat at the end of a dirt lane off Route 9 behind a farmhouse that wore its age with the particular dignity of structures that have been maintained by someone who cares about them but has no interest in making them appear newer or grander than they are. The front porch sagged at one end, a sag that had been there for years clearly, and had been left because the sag itself was now part of the structure's character, because correcting it would have been a kind of dishonesty. Old tools hung on wooden pegs along the outer wall of the barn in rows of careful, considered order. Not displayed, not stored carelessly, but arranged the way tools are arranged by someone who thinks about what they are doing when they put things away and why the doing of it well matters. A stone wall ran the perimeter of the backfield built in the local style with flat stacked stones and no mortar in the original sections, but with sections rebuilt in newer mortar. At several points, the kind of patient solitary repair work that takes a long time to do well when you are doing it alone, and that speaks of a person who finds a particular satisfaction in the kind of work that requires no audience and produces only the thing itself. The whole property had the quality of a life lived carefully and without much witness. Earl unlocked the large barn doors without ceremony, not with the drama of revelation, not with any quality of presentation, just the business-like unlocking of a place you have been the sole keeper of for a long time, and swung them wide. Dust fell in slow curtains from the rafters as the afternoon light came in from behind them and landed on something large and dark beneath a heavy canvas tarp. Earl pulled the cover back slowly. He did it the way you remove a covering from something that has earned the care of a slow reveal, with the unhurried deliberateness of a person who is not performing the gesture for an audience, but who performs it the same way regardless of whether anyone is watching, because the thing under the canvas deserves the same consideration whether or not it is being observed. The engine was enormous and black, trimmed in faded red and tarnished brass that had once been polished and had not been polished in 31 years, but retained under the tarnish the specific quality of brass that has been worked and cared for over a long period of time. Her boiler was barrel thick and long, her smoke box heavy and square at the front, her drive wheels nearly as tall as a standing man, their iron rims worn smooth by decades of rail contact to a surface finish that no manufacturing process produces, only years of work against iron track underload. She sat on her heavy iron frame with the settled, permanent weight of something that had worked very hard for a very long time and had then rested long enough that the rest had become its own kind of gravity. There was dust on every surface, the particular dust of enclosed spaces, gray and fine, that settles on things when no one touches them and no air moves. Rust had formed along the lower edge of the firebox door and at several connection points where moisture had found its way in over the decades. One exhaust pipe bore an old hand-welded repair, a section that had been replaced at some point in the machine's working life with new metal welded in with a weld that had held as well as the original and had been left exactly as it was because there was no reason to replace what worked with something that only looked better. Cody Mercer, who had come along at Weston's request, drew a quiet breath beside him. It was not a breath of wonder exactly. Mercer was a practical young man who was not given to theatrical responses, but of genuine unguarded surprise. The engine was not what he had been imagining on the drive over. It was larger and older and more present than the image of a 1908 steam traction engine that his mental library had produced. Dr. Weaver walked slowly around the front of the engine with her hands clasped behind her back, looking at it with the careful, non-committal attention of a professional who has not yet decided what she thinks and is not going to decide before she has finished looking. She paused at the main drive linkage and examined the connection between the piston arm and the drive wheel for a long moment without touching it. Earl walked along the boiler's flank, slowly running one hand lightly over the casing, not examining it, not checking it in any systematic way, just moving his palm along the familiar curve of it, the way a person touches something they have touched 10,000 times before, and finds in the texture of it the particular confirmation that the thing is still what it was. He moved without hurrying, without looking at anyone else in the barn, with the quality of attention of someone who is greeting something rather than inspecting it. He stopped at the main steam valve, a large brass handle, worn completely smooth on the grip from decades of the same hand closing around it, in the same way the smoothness, the record of all those thousands of closures, and he wrapped his fingers around it. He did not turn it. He stood there with his hand on the valve and his eyes closed and his head very slightly bowed, as still as the engine itself, as still as everything else in the barn, and the dust in the rafters settled around him without disturbing anything. And the barn went quiet in the particular way that spaces go quiet when everyone present understands without being told that something is happening that does not require commentary or explanation or any sound at all. For a long moment, nothing. Then from somewhere deep inside the cold iron body of the boiler in the dark interior of a machine that had not been fired in 31 years, that had been sitting in this dim barn since before Cody Mercer was born, that had been sealed inside its own cold silence since the autumn of 2003, came a sound. A tick, then another, then a slow rhythmic knock, low and resonant and unmistakable, the sound of metal responding to something it recognized, like something large and long dormant, stirring in stages from a very deep sleep, the way sleep releases a body one system at a time, one limb at a time, before it fully commits to waking. Weston took a step forwards without realizing he had moved. Earl opened his eyes. He looked at the engine with an expression that was quiet and certain, and entirely private, the expression not of discovery, but of confirmation of something known being found exactly where it was left. "She remembers," he said softly. He said it to the engine, not to anyone standing behind him. The words were not for the room. Then, without looking at anyone or pausing or marking the transition in any way, he turned and began organizing his tools. What none of them standing in that barn knew what Earl had not said and did not plan to say was the full weight of what it had cost him to pull off Route 9 and walk toward the staging area this morning. The full weight of what it meant that he was standing in this barn right now, that he had uncovered this engine, that his hand was on this valve. The full weight, which was not theoretical, but specific and personal, and had a name. His son's name had been Daniel. Daniel Briggs, born 1962, the only child of Earl and Margaret Briggs, raised on this farm and in this barn and on the back of this machine on early mornings, when the line was clear and the light was good and there was nowhere that needed to be reached by any particular time. Daniel had grown up understanding machines in the particular way that children understand things when they learn them very young, not as abstract systems to be studied, but as presences to be known with natures and tendencies, and the kind of reliability that comes from being properly understood and properly treated. He had learned the steam valve and the throttle and the cutoff valve and the exhaust injector and every other control on the 1908 engine by watching his father's hands on them, by asking questions that his father answered fully and without condescension, by putting his own hands on the controls while his father watched, and eventually by being trusted with them alone on those early mornings when Earl had things to attend to, and the boy was old enough and careful enough and serious enough to be trusted with something real. Daniel had become a railroad engineer because it was the only thing he had ever wanted to be from the time he was old enough to have a clear want. Earl had not pushed him toward it or steered him away from it. He had simply answered every question fully and taken him along to every place where the taking was possible, and let the boy see the work honestly, including the parts that were difficult and the parts that were dull. And Daniel had loved it unreservedly, throughout, which told Earl everything he needed to know about whether the vocation was genuine. He had been extraordinary at it, better than his father if Earl was honest with himself, which he made a practice of being. Daniel had an ear for machinery, a capacity to hear and interpret the sounds that engines make when they are working well and when they are not, that went beyond what Earl had taught him, beyond what could be taught at all. It was an intuitive attunement, the kind that some people are born with, in the same way that some people are born with perfect pitch, and it had made Daniel, by the time he was in his mid-30s, one of the most respected engineers on the secondary lines in the state. Earl had written the first technical warning in early 2002. It concerned a coupling system on a secondary line outside Helena, a fatigue pattern in the connector housing that he had identified from photographs a younger colleague had shown him, asking for an informal opinion, not understanding that the pattern he was looking at was significant. Earl had recognized it immediately. He had seen it once before in the 1970s on a different line under different conditions, and he remembered what it had preceded. The wear was the kind that announces itself quietly for months before it announces itself catastrophically, the kind that is entirely visible to someone who knows what they are looking at and entirely invisible to someone who does not. He had written the report with the care that a technical concern of that kind required, specific, documented, with reference to the precedent he knew of, and clear language about the nature of the risk and the timeline within which it needed to be addressed. He had sent it up the management chain with the confidence of someone who believes that the function of the chain is to receive and act on exactly this kind of information. He had received a response thanking him for his diligence and informing him the matter was under review. He wrote again 6 months later with additional detail and updated photographic documentation that a contact in the maintenance department had provided, and with a tone that was still professional, but that anyone reading carefully would have recognized as the tone of a man who has already raised this once and is not comfortable with the pace of the response. He received the same response. He wrote a third time in March of 2003. The language in the third report was different from the first two, still careful, still professional, because he understood that the effectiveness of a warning depended partly on its form, and that a warning that came across as alarmist or personal was easier to set aside than one that came across as measured and factual. But the urgency was in it for anyone who was reading what he had actually written, rather than scanning it for the level of immediate threat. He was trying to communicate that the window for preventing something was closing, and that the closing was not theoretical, but specific and time-sensitive. He received the same response. In October of 2003, a coupling separation on that secondary line outside Helena caused a catastrophic mechanical event at speed on a grade not unlike the one Weston Keller was standing on right now. Daniel was the engineer on duty that morning. He survived the initial event but died in the hospital 14 hours later from injuries sustained during the separation. Earl had stood at the grave in the November rain, a gray, cold Montana November. The rain coming down at a slight angle with the particular determination of autumn rain at altitude, and had felt the specific silence that settles over a loss that was not in any meaningful sense an accident. It had not been the result of an unforeseeable combination of circumstances. It had been the result of a foreseeable problem that had been foreseen, reported, documented, and not addressed by the people with the authority to address it. The silence at the grave had a quality that ordinary grief does not have, a quality that comes from knowing that the thing that killed your child was known about, and that you knew about it, and that the knowing had not been sufficient. He had come home from the cemetery that day still in the clothes he had worn to the funeral, still with the rain on his coat, and walked directly to the barn without going inside. He had walked to the engine and stood in front of her for a moment with no particular thought in his mind, just the standing and the presence of the machine and what the machine represented, the knowledge, the years, the certainty that the knowledge mattered, and the way the system had used that certainty as a substitute for action, while his son went to work on a line with a failing coupling that the people above him already knew about. He had pulled the canvas over her with the slow and careful movements of a man doing something definitive, something he does not plan to revisit. He had tucked the edges in with the same thoroughness with which he did everything, because the thoroughness was simply how he did things, regardless of the circumstances or the emotional weight of the action. And then he had gone inside and taken off his coat and sat at the kitchen table in the dark and begun the long, slow, unannounced process of changing into a different kind of man, a man who had left the rails behind, who did not go near the tracks, who had made his accommodation with the loss and was not going to tear it open again. He had been that man for 23 years. He had been it quietly, without drama, without the kind of public grief or public bitterness that some people carry and display. He had been it on the farm with the stone walls and the tools in the early mornings and the slow, sustaining rhythms of a life lived close to the ground. He had not been unhappy. He wanted to be honest about that. He had not been unhappy. He had been reduced, perhaps, from something he had been before, but reduced in the way that things are reduced when they are simplified rather than damaged, when the unnecessary is removed until only the essential remains. He had been that man until this morning. He had driven Route 9 the way he sometimes drove it on mornings when the restlessness was bad, not toward anything specific, not with any destination, just through the familiar country, with his hands on the wheel, and the mountains doing what they always did, and the road doing what it always did, and the early morning silence doing what it had always done, which was let him be inside himself without the demand of any particular response. He had driven it perhaps 100 times in 23 years for this same reason. He had seen the yellow trucks from the road. He had slowed and then stopped without deciding to. The truck simply slowed and stopped the way a truck stops, when the person driving it has ceased to direct it, the way things stop when the attention that was sustaining them is suddenly elsewhere. He had sat in the truck for perhaps 3 minutes looking at the scene, the locomotive, the recovery vehicles, the organized, professional, confidence-laden response to something he had understood in the first 30 seconds of looking at it, not because of anything special about this particular morning or this particular angle of light, but because this was the knowledge he had built over 19 years, and it was the same as it had always been, and the scene in front of him fit the pattern he had cataloged, and the pattern told him clearly what the problem was and what it needed. He had thought about Daniel, not as a reason to stop or to go, more as a presence alongside the understanding, the way certain knowledge and certain grief have lived in the same part of you for so long that they stop feeling like separate things, the way a room and the person you associate with the room stop being entirely distinguishable. He had thought Daniel would have come. That was the thought, specific and unambiguous. Daniel, who had his father's knowledge and his own ear above it, who had been better at this than his father in the ways that matter, would have looked at this scene from the road and understood it and would not have been able to drive past it. Not because he was obligated to stop, not because it was his job or his responsibility, but because driving past something you can fix when it needs fixing, that was simply not something Daniel was built to do. Earl Briggs was 78 years old. He had made his accommodations. But he was also still the man who had run this line for 19 years. He was still the man who had written 3 warnings and been right about all of them. He was still the man who knew what that locomotive needed and could provide it. The grief had not taken the knowledge. The distance had not dissolved it. It was still there, intact and functional and waiting like pressure in a sealed boiler. He had gotten out of the truck. He had not told any of this to Weston Keller, and he did not plan to. But as he worked in the afternoon light of the barn, clearing the firebox of the compressed ash and debris of 3 decades, testing the valve seals with his fingers, running his hands along the steam pipe connections with the practiced attention of a man who knows by feel what is right and what is not, he was aware of it in his hands, in the particular care he gave to each component, in the patience with which he moved through the preparation, refusing to rush the parts that could not be rushed, taking the time that each thing required because the time was not negotiable and had never been. She remembers he had said, he was not entirely sure he had not also been saying it about himself. Cody Mercer proved genuinely useful without needing to be told how, which was the thing about him that Weston had always valued, and that was proving its value again now. He was the kind of young man who understood the shape of a problem by watching someone work it, who could read the requirements of a task from the sequence of actions being taken and position himself to support the next step before it was asked for. He handed tools before they were requested. He worked in silence when silence was what the work required. He asked 2 questions in the first hour and none after that because the 2 questions gave him what he needed to work independently on the tasks Earl directed him to. By the second hour, Mercer was doing real work checking the auxiliary steam connections, systematically clearing the secondary ash traps at the base of the firebox, running a pressure integrity test on the boiler feed line at Earl's direction, using a procedure that Earl explained once clearly and that Mercer executed correctly the first time without needing to have anything repeated. Weston sat on a hay bale near the barn doors for most of the 4 hours. He had learned over 22 years that there were situations in which the most useful thing a person with authority could do was stay out of the way of the people who knew what they were doing, and this was one of them. He made the calls that needed to be made. Pierce had called again, and he answered this time, keeping the conversation short and the information sparse, buying the remaining time without giving Pierce enough detail to second-guess the decision from Portland. He watched Earl work without interrupting. He watched Mercer learn the shape of the machine from the man who knew it, and he watched the way that learning happened. Not through formal instruction, but through close, serious attention, through the kind of watching a person does when they understand they are in the presence of something worth paying attention to. Dr. Weaver circled the engine twice more during the preparation, each time with a slightly different quality of attention, the first time still with the cautious reserve of her initial assessment, the second time with something that was not yet endorsement, but was closer to genuine interest. At one point, she asked Earl a technical question about the relationship between the steam cutoff setting and the torque output at low speeds, and Earl answered it precisely and without preamble, and she wrote something on her tablet and stood near the boiler for several minutes afterward with an expression that had changed in some small but visible way from what it had been when she first walked into the barn. The 4 hours became 4 hours and 22 minutes. Nobody marked the extra 22 minutes or mentioned them. When Earl stepped back from the firebox and looked at Mercer and gave a short nod that meant the preparation was complete, the time felt irrelevant in the way that the duration of a long and careful task becomes irrelevant once the task is done. The work had taken the time the work required. When the engine rolled out of the barn on her own iron wheels, slowly, steadily, under a controlled head of steam that Earl managed with the same care he had given every other part of the preparation, the small crowd at the lane gate went quiet without anyone organizing the quiet. It simply happened the way silence happens when a room full of people encounters something that is larger than their commentary. She moved at a walking pace, her drive wheels turning in slow, deliberate rotations, black smoke rising in a thin column from her stack into the amber late afternoon air. The ground transmitted each piston stroke upward through the soles of your boots as a low, unhurried thump, not the sharp, aggressive percussion of the recovery vehicles, but something fundamentally different, something that had a kind of mass and patience built into it at the level of the engineering itself. The sound of a machine working in deep rhythm with the task it was built for. Earl walked alongside her with one hand resting on the running board rail, guiding her down the dirt lane, with the ease of someone walking beside something they have walked beside, before something they trust completely, and that trusts them in return, a relationship formed over 19 years that the 31 years of silence had apparently not dissolved. In the staging area, Harley Dixon had positioned himself against his truck with his arms crossed, watching the old engine come down Route 9 with an expression that moved through several distinct phases before arriving at something carefully neutral. He said nothing as the engine rolled past him. He watched it go with the deliberate blankness of a man who is managing what his face is allowed to show in a situation he has not anticipated and does not yet have a position on. The technical problem that had occupied the 4 hours and 22 minutes was not, as Weston had initially assumed, simply the challenge of getting a century-old machine operational. That part had proceeded as Earl said it would, steadily and without drama, with the unhurried competence of someone working fully within the boundaries of their knowledge. The harder problem, the one that had actually required the majority of the preparation time and the majority of Earl's ingenuity, had been the connection. Locomotive 983 carried a modern AAR coupler at her nose, a standardized fitting that had been developed and adopted decades after the 1908 engine was built. The traction engine had no compatible hitch and no provision for one. A direct mechanical link between the two machines was impossible with any standard equipment available at the site. What Earl had assembled instead was remarkable in its economy and in the depth of understanding that its simplicity concealed. 2 lengths of high-tension logging chain from the back corner of the barn, coiled under a canvas so long that the canvas had begun to deteriorate around them. A salvaged yoke beam from an old farm implement stored under a tarpaulin against the rear barn wall, a piece of hardware originally designed to distribute pulling load across the dual hitch points of a team of draft animals built to spread force rather than concentrate it. 4 heavy shackle links that Mercer had sourced from Harmon's supply trailer, the only external contribution Earl had requested and the only one the problem required. Using these components, Earl had fabricated a transfer rig, a bridging assembly that distributed the pulling load across 3 separate anchor points on Locomotive 983's front chassis, frame 2 at the lower frame rails and 1 at the central cross member, rather than concentrating the force at the single coupler point where the locked wheel pressure would oppose it most directly. The geometry of the 3-point attachment with the chains running at specific angles determined by the yoke beam's position created a resultant force that engaged the chassis structure along multiple axes, simultaneously working with the mechanical reality of how the train was loaded and resting rather than against the single point of maximum resistance. It was not a factory solution. It was not something that would appear in any recovery manual or engineering specification. It was the solution of someone who understood at a level that preceded formal analysis how force distributes through metal structures under load, not as theoretical knowledge but as working knowledge, built from years of applying forces to iron and observing what the iron did in response, what it accepted and what it refused, and why. Dr. Weaver walked around the completed rig after it was installed at the staging area twice slowly with the thorough attention she gave everything. She crouched to examine each shackle connection, testing the angle of the chain, with her hand pressing her palm against the yoke beam to assess its rigidity under her weight, running her eye along the full geometry of the assembly from multiple perspectives. When she stood, her expression had completed its journey from caution to something that was, if not quite endorsement, at least genuine respect for what she was looking at. "The load distribution geometry is mechanically sound," she said. She said it to Weston in a measured tone. "The 3-point attachment geometry is correct. The force vectors will engage the chassis in a way that should reduce rather than increase binding pressure at the wheel contact." She paused with the brief pause of someone making an admission. "It's a better approach than anything I would have specified." Earl gave a short nod and climbed into the operator's position without responding. The staging area settled into quiet gradually without anyone directing it. The Harmon crew members, who had been maintaining their positions near their trucks, drifted inward without seeming to decide to drawn by the quality of what was happening, or by the silence, or by some instinct that certain moments deserved to be witnessed fully rather than observed from a distance. Mercer took his position, crouched near the front wheel assembly of Locomotive 983, where he could watch the rail contact point directly. Weston stood 10 yards back with his arms at his sides and his phone in his hand with the screen dark. Dixon leaned against his truck with his arms crossed watching. It was then that Dixon's phone rang. Weston did not hear it ring. He heard Dixon answer it, the movement of a man stepping away from the main group, the quiet establishment of a private space, the particular way someone holds a phone when they do not want what they are saying to carry. But the mountain had gone still in the specific way it goes still in the late afternoon when the wind drops and the day begins its turn toward evening. And in that stillness, sound carried differently than it had. The name Weston heard was Pierce. He heard enough of Dixon's side of the conversation to understand its framing. Dixon was not lying in the technical sense. He was selecting, choosing which facts to include and which to leave out, choosing the order in which to present them, choosing a tone that communicated his own professional assessment of the situation without stating it explicitly. An old man, a museum piece, a field operation deviating from standard recovery protocols, a project manager who had made an unorthodox call under pressure. Weston's phone buzzed in his hand before Dixon had finished the call. He let it buzz twice, organizing what he was going to say, and then answered. Pierce's voice was the voice of institutional authority that has been kept waiting and has decided not to perform the annoyance, but wants its presence understood. Weston, tell me what is actually happening up there in plain language from the beginning. We have an unconventional approach in progress, Weston said. The standard recovery operation failed completely. 6 hours, 19 vehicles, 2 cracked tow bars, a structural engineer's assessment of 3 to 5 additional days with $2 million in cargo risk. I identified an alternative approach with a shorter timeline and authorized it. I'm hearing the alternative approach involves an old man and a steam engine from before the First World War. That is an accurate description of the equipment, yes. Pierce was quiet for a moment. The quality of the quiet communicated several things simultaneously, and none of them were comfortable. Weston, you understand how this looks. I understand what the alternative looks like, Weston said. His voice was even. The evenness was genuine, not performed. He had made the decision he had made, and he was not retroactively uncertain about it. 3 to 5 more days. A partial unloading operation on the side of a mountain. Portland delayed with the full cascade of consequences that involves. That is the alternative, and it has $2 million of additional risk attached to it. He paused. I need 2 more hours. You've already used 4. 2 more hours, Weston said again. If it doesn't work, I authorize the Weaver plan myself, and I take full accountability for every hour of delay from this morning onward. All of it. My name, my decision, my consequence. Another silence. This one shorter. The brevity of it communicated something different from the length of the first one. 2 hours, Pierce said. Not a minute passed. The call ended. Weston lowered his phone and looked across the staging area to where Dixon had finished his call and was turning back toward the group. Their eyes met across the distance. Dixon held the look for a moment, not challenging exactly, but not backing away from it either, the look of a man who has done what he has done and is not going to pretend he hasn't. Then he looked away toward his trucks. Weston turned back toward Earl and the engine. The boiler had been building for 11 minutes. Earl managed it with the steady, particular attention of someone reading a language. They have spoken fluently for decades, not fast, not visibly cautious, just continuously attentive, in the way of someone for whom this kind of attention is simply the normal condition of engagement with the task. Small adjustments to the pressure valve made without drama, each one the product of what the gauge was showing and what his hands felt through the controls. The exhaust moved in long, measured pulses. Steam curled white from the relief valve and drifted low across the tracks in the cooling mountain air. Everything about the way Earl occupied the operator's seat and worked the controls was the opposite of the recovery operation that had filled this mountain all day. Where Harmon's crews had been aggressive and urgent, their machinery loud and percussive, and confident in the way of organizations that have built their reputation on not failing Earl, was quiet. Not withdrawn, not small, but quiet in the way of someone for whom the work itself is sufficient and does not require accompaniment. He did not look at the crowd behind him. He did not look toward Dixon or Weaver or Weston. He looked at his gauges and at the connection point between the 2 machines and at the track ahead of the locomotive, and he built the pressure in the boiler with the same patience with which he had prepared it in the barn, refusing to rush the parts that could not be rushed, giving each stage the full time it required. At minute 11, he reached for the main throttle and opened it. Not quickly, not with the quality of an announcement or a demonstration, with the controlled and precise motion of someone who has done this 10,000 times and understands that how you begin determines everything about what follows. that the nature of the initial engagement sets the conditions for everything the resistance will or will not do in response. The chains pulled taut. The yoke beam settled into tension with a low, solid sound, the sound of something finding its proper position under load. The 1908 engine leaned into her load not dramatically, not with any visible strain, but with the quiet, full weight of a machine that had been built to work and that had rested long enough to approach the work again with something close to eagerness, or whatever the equivalent of eagerness is in a machine built from iron and brass and fire. Nothing moved. Locomotive 983 sat exactly where she had sat since 6:14 that morning. The rails did not creak. The drive wheels did not turn. The sounds were the rhythmic, deep chuffing of the old engine working under sustained load, the tight vibration of the chains finding their tension, and the specific quality of human silence that settles over a group of people watching something they are not sure will succeed. Earl held the pressure exactly where it was. He did not push harder. He did not adjust anything. He held the engine at her working load, steady, sustained, patient for a full 90 seconds, watching the pressure gauge hold steady in its range and watching the connection point between the chains and the locomotive's front chassis with the focused attention of someone waiting for information that only the machine can provide. Then he eased back, let the engine breathe, and sat motionless in the operator's seat with his eyes on the space between the two machines. "That's it." Dixon's voice came from behind the group, flat and final, the voice of a verdict. "You've had your shot. Let the professionals handle this." Nobody responded to him. Weston kept his eyes on Earl. Earl waited one full minute, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes unmoving from the chain assembly and the coupling point. The minute was complete and unhurried, and nobody shortened it. Then he reached forward and opened the throttle again. This time differently. Not a sustained push, but a pulsed application. 2-second builds, then a brief release, then building again. Building, releasing, building in a rhythm that was deliberate and specific, that had been chosen for reasons the machine understood better than anyone watching. The engine's exhaust changed in response, her pistons finding the new cadence, her drive wheels engaging the rail in slow, deliberate half rotations, each one a patient inquiry put to the locked wheel assembly ahead of her, not demanding, asking in the only language that iron understands, not speech but rhythm, not instruction, but the repeated patient, correctly timed application of the right kind of pressure. The chains vibrated with a different quality than before, not the tight, sharp vibration of maximum load, but a lower, more complex resonance, the vibration of load being distributed and engaged rather than concentrated and forced. The yoke beam hummed, and then so subtly that two people in the group later said independently that they thought they had imagined it. Locomotive 983 moved. Not much, not even a full inch. A single low metallic groan traveled the full 300 feet of the train, from the engine nose to the last coupled car, the sound of 32 loaded cars shifting fractionally against 32 sets of locked wheels, the sound of something enormous beginning in the smallest possible way to reconsider its position. Like a door sealed for years beginning its first fractional movement in a frame that has swollen with time. Then it stopped. The engine pulled. The chains held their tension. The locomotive did not move again. Cody Mercer stood up slowly from his crouched position near the front wheel assembly. He had been watching the rail contact point with complete attention, and he stood with the expression of a man who is honest enough not to shape his face around what he wants to be true. "One shift," he said quietly. He looked at Weston. She resettled. "The lock is tighter now than before the shift. Whatever movement happened compressed the contact further." He stopped. "It's not going to work, Mr. Keller." A long silence followed. The old engine continued to breathe slow and steady, and unhurried, her boiler working in the cooling mountain air with the same patient rhythm it had maintained since Earl first opened the firebox in the barn, now 4 hours and 40-odd minutes ago. As though the assessment had not been delivered, as though patience were not a response to circumstances, but a permanent condition, the fixed ground of her existence, something that circumstances could not alter because it was prior to circumstances. Then Earl spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the gauge panel in front of him, his hands resting with a particular quietness on the controls, and he said it the way a man says something he knows to be true and sees no practical reason to surround with additional language. "She moved." Nobody spoke. "You all felt it," he said. "Every wheel on that train shifted. Every single one." He made a small, precise adjustment to the pressure valve, a movement so contained it was easy to miss if you were not specifically watching for it. That was the lock beginning to break. Not breaking, beginning to break. What just happened is not a failure. He paused. That train just woke up. Weston looked at him. Mercer looked at the ground. Dr. Weaver stood very still with her tablet held flat against her chest. Earl turned back to his gauges and began building pressure again. His hands moved with the quiet certainty of a man who knows exactly what comes next, who has known since this morning what it would require and in what sequence, and who is simply working through those requirements with the patience of someone who understands that patience is not waiting. It is a form of work as specific and skilled applied continuously in the direction of the thing that needs to happen. He built the pressure slowly, watching the gauge with the steady attention of a man reading a familiar text. And he thought about Daniel. He thought about Daniel the way he sometimes thought about him when he was doing something that required his full attention. Not the grief of the loss, but the presence of the life Daniel alongside the work in the way he had always been alongside it from the time he was a boy, watching his father's hands on these same controls. The particular quality of Daniel's attention when he was learning something, that total unself-conscious focus, the focus of a person who has found the thing they were meant to do and is doing it with their whole self. The way he had looked at the gauge panel the first time Earl trusted him with the throttle alone, not excited, not nervous, but deeply and seriously present, as though understanding that he had been given something real to be equal to and was going to be equal to it. Earl had thought, standing at the grave in November rain 23 years ago, that the worst thing was not the loss itself. The loss was total and permanent and had taken something from him that had never come back, and those facts were true and would always be true. But they were not the worst thing. The worst thing was that it did not need to happen. It had been preventable. It had been prevented in every way that prevention is possible, except the one way that mattered. It had not been prevented by the people with the authority to prevent it, who had treated the warning as a formality and the formality as sufficient. He had covered the engine because he could not look at it without thinking about all of that, about the knowledge and the pride in the knowledge and the certainty that the knowledge mattered, and how the system had used that certainty, had used his warnings, had used his documented concern, had used the paper trail he had carefully created as a substitute for action, as evidence that the issue was being addressed, when what it was evidence of was only that the issue had been noted. His son had died on a line with a known failing coupling, and the knowing had not been enough. He had not been able to separate the machine from the grief for 23 years. He was not entirely sure he had separated them now, but something had shifted in him this morning when he stood at the tree line and felt the understanding arrive with the same clean certainty it had always arrived with, intact, unchanged, still his, still true. The grief had not taken it. The distance had not dissolved it. 19 years of honest work does not dissolve. It waits. He opened the throttle. He did not increase the pressure. That was the thing that nobody standing behind him fully understood, because everyone behind him was still in some deep layer of their thinking approaching the problem in terms of force, more of it better directed, more sustained. The gauge had not moved. The engine was not working harder than it had been. What Earl changed was the nature of the stroke. He adjusted the cutoff valve, the control governing how long steam is admitted into each cylinder per piston cycle, opening it slightly wider. Simultaneously, he reduced the main throttle by a careful fraction, lowering the overall pressure while lengthening each power stroke, allowing the pistons to extract more mechanical work from the same volume of steam. Less energy fighting the engine's own momentum, more torque delivered per revolution. A longer, slower, deeper engagement with the resistance ahead, power shaped differently. Rather than power increased the way the same physical effort applied, with full understanding, accomplishes what the same effort applied with only confidence cannot. The exhaust changed. The rapid, urgent chuffing of the first attempt, the sound of a machine working hard at the limit of what its pressure would support, softened into something lower and longer and fundamentally different in character. A deep, measured drum beat, each stroke full and deliberate, each one pressing the drive wheels against the rail with the controlled and even weight of something that knows what it is doing and is doing it without haste. The way a hand presses against a surface it is trying to understand rather than overcome. Earl made one final adjustment, a small reduction to the exhaust injector, increasing back pressure slightly in the cylinders, giving each piston stroke a longer and more deliberate push against the load. Less like a hand striking, more like a shoulder leaning, patient, sustained, working with the resistance rather than across it. He held everything exactly where it was. He let the machine work. For 7 seconds, nothing happened. The mountain was very still. The chains were taut and resonating at a low frequency that you could feel in your chest if you were standing close enough. The yoke beam held its position without the groan of a structure being asked to do more than it was designed for. It simply held quietly as designed. The drive wheels of the 1908 engine turned in their full deliberate rotations. Then locomotive 983 moved. Not a shudder, not the single fractional shift of before that brief and inconclusive motion that had raised and then immediately disappointed. She moved with a deep iron groan that rolled the full 300 feet of her length from the engine nose to the last coupled car, her drive wheels breaking free from the embedded railhead in a slow, sequential release. One axle at a time, each one giving way to the pressure as the previous one released the way. A hand opens finger by finger when it has been gripping something for a very long time and finally receives permission to let go. The 32 cars behind her shifted and swayed as the slack worked forward through the couplings from front to rear, a long, low wave of released tension passing through 300 feet of loaded metal, the specific sound of a large and complex system moving from lock to free. Then the train was rolling. 1 foot, 2, 5, gaining a measured and controlled momentum that was nothing like the desperate, straining application of force that had occupied this mountain since dawn. It was the movement of something that had been persuaded rather than compelled. The movement of something that had in its own way and in its own time decided that it was ready. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Dr. Sandra Weaver had both hands pressed flat against her mouth. Her eyes were wide above her hands, and she did not blink, and she did not lower her hands. Cody Mercer was standing with his arms completely still at his sides, watching the front wheels of locomotive 983 turn with an expression that said clearly that he was witnessing something he had not been given an adequate framework for understanding, and that he was simply receiving it with his full attention, and would think about what it meant later. Two of the Harmon crew members at the back of the group had taken unconscious steps forward, drawn by the movement, in the way that people are drawn towards something that they have been told is impossible and are watching happen. Harley Dixon had straightened up from his truck. He was standing with his arms loose at his sides and his mouth slightly open, and the expression on his face was unlike anything it had shown all day. The assured confidence of the morning was gone. The defensive skepticism of the afternoon was gone. The calculated neutrality he had maintained since the engine arrived was gone. What remained was simpler and more honest than any of those managed presentations, the expression of a man whose professional identity has just encountered something it cannot categorize, who is standing very still. Because stillness is the only appropriate response to something you do not yet have the words for. Weston Keller watched the train move and felt something rise in his chest that had nothing to do with logistics or professional vindication or the resolution of a crisis. It was quieter and more personal than any of that. It was the feeling of watching patience outlast certainty, of watching one man and one machine, built 116 years ago, do something that 19 modern vehicles in 6 hours of organized professional effort had declared impossible, and do it not by being more powerful but by being more right, by understanding something the others had never slowed down long enough to ask. Earl held the engine at her working pace for 2 full minutes. He moved locomotive 983 steadily forward along the grade until she had traveled nearly 40 feet from her original position, and every locked wheel assembly had fully and unambiguously freed itself from the embedded rail contact. He moved her until there was no version of the outcome that required interpretation, no possibility of the result being claimed by anyone as less than complete. Then he eased the throttle back with the same deliberateness with which he had opened it, brought the engine to a stop, and engaged the brake. He sat still in the operator's seat for a moment after the engine went quiet. Just a moment, long enough to let the work settle into whatever category of experience it belonged to. The mountain was quiet around him. The chains hung slack. The last light of the day was going thin and gold above the western ridge, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the eastern sky above the ridgeline. Then he climbed down from the platform slowly without ceremony, and began disconnecting the chains from the yoke beam. Weston walked over. The crowd parted without being asked. He stopped beside Earl and stood there while the old man worked the first shackle pin loose with the wrench from his jacket pocket. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The mountain around them was settling into evening in the specific, unhurried way that mountains settle, the temperature dropping steadily with the light. "Mr. Briggs." Earl glanced up. "Why couldn't anyone else do that?" Weston asked. The question came out the way honest questions do, without preamble or management, direct, the genuine need to understand something that has just reorganized the categories through which you have been looking at a subject. We had the best equipment in the region. Experienced operators who have done this work for decades. A structural engineer who published papers on this specific problem. Why did none of it work? Earl worked the pin free and set the shackle on the ground with care. They were all thinking about pulling, he said. He moved to the second shackle. Pulling harder, pulling with better rated equipment, pulling from better angles. Every solution that was tried today was the same solution expressed at a different scale. The assumption underneath each of them was that the problem was a force problem, that if you applied enough force in the right direction, the resistance would give way. He paused. But the problem was never about force. It was about the nature of how the force was applied. That wheel lock needed rhythm, not strength. It needed load delivered in a pattern the metal could respond to gradually, with the right cadence, in a way that gave the resistance room to give way rather than compressing it further. He looked up at Weston briefly. "You can't bully iron. You work with its nature or you don't move it. There is no third option." Weston looked at locomotive 983, sitting free on the track in the evening light, 40 feet from where she had been. Her wheels clear. The problem that had been declared to require 3 to 5 more days resolved in under 2 hours. "You made it look simple," Weston said. "It is simple," Earl said. "That's the part that gets lost." He freed the second shackle and began coiling the first chain. Somewhere along the way, the field stopped teaching people how these machines actually work. It taught them how to operate them, how to run the systems, how to follow the procedures, how to interpret the instruments. That's real knowledge. I'm not dismissing it. He looked up again. But they stopped learning how to listen to them, how to read what the machine is telling you about the nature of the problem. And listening is most of what this work actually is. It was most of what it was when I was doing it, and I suspect it still is. Weston was quiet for a moment. "Why did you come today?" he asked. The question had been building in him since the barn, since the moment Earl had put his hand on the valve and said she remembers. "You retired in 1978. You've been away from the rails for it's been a very long time. What made you stop when you saw the trucks?" Earl stopped working. He stood with the yoke beam in both hands and was still for a long moment. The engine made a small sound as her metal began to cool, a single tick like a clock marking the passage of a particular second. When he spoke, his voice was the same quiet it had always been, but something was visible in it now that had not been visible before, a weight that had always been present underneath everything and was only now being allowed to surface. "I had a son," he said. "Daniel. He was an engineer like me. He died in 2003. A coupling failure on a secondary line outside Helena, a maintenance issue that had been documented, reported, and not addressed." He set the yoke beam on the running board with care. "I had written 3 warnings about that coupling system in the 18 months before it failed. Each time I was told the matter was under review." He straightened slowly. "Daniel was the engineer on duty the morning the coupling separated." Weston said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. The moment had a specific gravity that additional words would only reduce. "I covered the engine the week after his funeral," Earl said. "I drove Route 9 one last time, and then I went home, and I covered her, and I didn't go near the tracks again. I thought I was finished with all of it." He was quiet for a moment. "This morning I drove Route 9 because I sometimes drive it when the mornings are long. I saw the yellow trucks. I stopped." He paused. "I could see what the problem was from the road. I could see it immediately the way I would have seen it in any year of those 19. And I thought about Daniel, not as a reason to stop or to go, just his presence alongside the understanding, the way certain knowledge and certain grief have lived in the same part of you for long enough that they stop feeling entirely separate." He looked at Weston. "Daniel would have come," he said. The statement was simple and direct, the statement of a fact about a person known completely. "He had a better ear for these machines than I did. He would have understood what that locomotive needed in 30 seconds, and he would not have been able to drive past it. That was not in him. He paused. I thought I am still the man who ran this line. The grief didn't take the knowledge. It was still there intact, waiting. If he would have come, then I should come. He looked at the engine. So I got out of the truck. The mountain was very still around them. The stars above the eastern ridge were bright and dense in the cold mountain air, the specific brightness of stars at altitude on clear autumn nights. Weston stood in the stillness for a moment, holding what he had just been given. He was thinking about the part, about the knowledge, being intact about it, waiting there unchanged through 23 years of distance and grief, about what it meant to carry something for that long and have it still be exactly what it was, about what you had to be made of to do that. He was also thinking about his own 22 years, about what he had stopped listening to over the course of building a career, what questions he had stopped asking, what original quality of engagement with the work he had set aside quietly and incrementally in the process of becoming very good at managing it. I'm glad you came, Weston said. Earl nodded short, understated the nod of a man who does not need more than a sincere thing said simply. He turned to climb back into the operator's seat. That was when Harley Dixon walked over. He came alone without his vest, his hands at his sides. He walked with the careful, deliberate pace of a man who knows what he is about to do and has decided that not doing it would be a worse failure than anything the day had already produced. He stopped at the edge of the engine's shadow. Earl was on the second running board step, one hand on the rail, and he stopped and looked at Dixon. Dixon did not perform an apology. He was not built for performances of that kind, and Earl, looking at him, would have found the performance less than the plain thing. I've been doing this work for 22 years, Dixon said. His voice was even and direct. I've moved things that most operations won't attempt. I've been the difference between a project surviving and failing more times than I can count. I have never in 22 years seen anything like what I watched today. He stopped. He looked at the two machines, the old engine and the freed locomotive, still connected by the slack chains and the yoke beam. And I want you to know that I understand what I was looking at. Earl looked at Dixon for a long moment. He read something in Dixon's face, not performance, not managed accountability, but something more genuine and more difficult. The expression of a man encountering for perhaps the first time a form of knowledge that his confidence cannot contain or categorize. A man learning something real. Earl gave a single nod, short, quiet, complete. The nod of a man who has received something offered in good faith and found it sufficient. Dixon nodded back. Then he turned and walked back toward his trucks. Earl climbed the rest of the way into the operator's seat. He opened the throttle slowly. The engine came back to life with a low, familiar exhale of steam, patient and unhurried, and entirely itself the same as she had been in the barn this morning, the same as she had been on this very line in 1963 and 1971, and every year of those 19 in between. He guided her slowly back up Route 9 toward the dirt lane in the barn, at the same walking pace, without looking back. Nobody called after him. Nobody tried to stop him or offer anything or ask him to remain. They stood at the edge of the mountain road, Weston, Mercer, Weaver, Dixon, the full 19-vehicle crew with all their equipment and credentials and organizational confidence, and they watched him go in the specific silence of people who have just seen something they do not yet have adequate language for. The sound of the engine faded slowly into the trees, the deep rhythmic chuffing diminishing with distance until it was indistinguishable from the other sounds of the mountain evening, and then it was gone. There was only the cooling air and the last light on the western ridge, and locomotive 983 sitting free on the track, ready to continue her journey south, as though the day's entire struggle had been a dream that the coming night was gently, patiently erasing. Weston stood there for a long time after the crew had dispersed, after Mercer had gone back to begin the repair assessment, and Weaver had retreated to her rental car, and Dixon had quietly begun standing down the Harmon convoy. He stood at the edge of the gravel road with his phone in his hand and the screen dark, and he thought. He thought about what Earl had said, not the technical part, which was clear and correct, and would change things in how Weston approached this category of problem going forward. He thought about the other part, about the knowledge intact after 23 years, about the grief that had covered it but not dissolved it, about the son who had learned the knowledge from his father's hands and carried it forward and then been taken by a system that had treated a documented warning as evidence of adequate response rather than as a call to action. He thought about his own 22 years, about what he had been very good at and what that goodness had cost him in terms of the original thing, about the calls handled well and the crises managed and the reputation maintained, and what in the course of all that maintaining he had stopped listening to. He had become extremely good at managing problems. He was less certain standing here in the mountain evening that he had remained good at understanding them, at the deep patient, listening, kind of understanding that produces solutions rather than managing the absence of them. He had never lost a person. He was clear with himself about that, careful not to appropriate what was not his. But he thought, lost something over 22 years of this work, some original quality of engagement, some willingness to slow down enough to hear what the problem was actually saying, rather than what the available procedures were designed to address. Earl Briggs had covered an engine and stayed away from everything it represented for 23 years, and when he finally stopped on a mountain road and looked at a locked locomotive, the knowledge was still there, intact, waiting. He wondered about his own knowledge, whether what he had set aside in the process of becoming who he was professionally was still there somewhere intact, waiting for the morning he decided to stop driving past it. He put his phone in his jacket pocket without making the call to Pierce. He would make it tomorrow. He would give Pierce the outcome and the assessment and the professional framing that the situation required. But tonight he wanted a few more minutes in the quiet the engine had left behind, standing on a mountain road in the fading light, thinking about what he had seen and what it had asked of him that he had not yet fully answered. The stars were fully out when he walked back to his truck. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel before starting the engine, looking at the track where locomotive 983 sat free and still in the dark. And then he started the engine and drove back down Route 9 toward the lower canyon and the world that was waiting for him to return to it. The next morning came clear and cold, the mountains sharp and definite against a pale blue sky, the kind of autumn morning that high country produces occasionally, as though to demonstrate what clarity looks like when everything unnecessary has been stripped away by cold air and altitude. Earl rose before dawn the way he always did. He made coffee in the farmhouse kitchen in the reliable dark of early morning, the sequence of it so practiced it required no light and no thought, the familiar weight of the pot, the sound of the water, the particular smell of the grounds that was one of the constants of his mornings, unchanged for decades. He stood at the kitchen window with the mug held in both hands and watched the eastern ridge for the first signs of the sky beginning to separate itself from the darkness, the barely perceptible gradation of black into very deep blue that precedes the gray of dawn by 15 minutes or so, visible only if you are looking for it in the right place. Then he set the mug on the counter and dressed and walked out to the barn. The door swung open without ceremony. The engine stood where he had left her, solid and dark in the pre-dawn light, the canvas cover folded on the hay bale beside her where he had placed it the night before. He had not covered her back up when he returned. He had come back to the barn in the dark with a lantern and walked slowly around her, checking the valve positions and the chain storage and the condition of the connections he had fabricated, doing the end-of-work assessment that he had done at the end of every working day for 19 years. Not because it was required, but because it was how you kept things right, and keeping things right had always been its own justification. He had folded the canvas and placed it on the hay bale and gone inside without deciding what that meant or whether it meant anything. He walked along her flank now in the gray pre-light, running one hand over the boiler casing with the familiar unhurried attention of the morning greeting. The iron was still faintly warm under his palm, the residual warmth that iron holds for days after a heavy firing, a warmth you have to be specifically looking for to detect a warmth that is there whether or not anyone is paying attention to it. He moved from the smoke box to the main boiler, to the firebox door, his hand reading the surface of the machine, the way a person reads the surface of something they have been reading for a very long time. He stopped at the main steam valve and stood there with his hand on the worn brass grip. Outside, a hawk was making its first slow circles above the backfield, in the early light riding the thermals that form as the cold night ground releases its held heat into the warming air of morning. The barn door stood open, and the air coming in smelled like pine and cold earth, and the particular clarity of a mountain autumn morning, the smell of a day that had not yet committed itself to anything. Earl stood with his hand on the valve and thought about Daniel. He thought about Daniel the way he thought about him on the best mornings, which was not the grief of the absence, but the fullness of the presence. Daniel at 12, at 20, at 30, at 41, each version of him, a complete and particular person that Earl had known more thoroughly than he had known any other person in his life. Because that is what children are to parents who pay attention, fully known in a way that no one else quite manages to be, in a way that persists long after the knowing can no longer be added to. He thought about Daniel at 12 in this exact operator's seat on an early winter morning on the Rocky Pass line, with snow on the timber and good light, and his careful young hands on the throttle, and his eyes on the gauge panel, with that total and unself-conscious seriousness. The seriousness of a child who has found the thing they were meant to do and is doing it with everything they have without any awareness that this is remarkable. He thought about the question Daniel had asked him that morning. He had asked many questions on many mornings. He was a boy who asked questions that deserved real answers and who could tell when he was getting one. But this particular question had stayed with the Earl with a clarity that other memories had not retained. Dad, how do you know when to stop pushing and when to hold? Earl had stood with his hands on the controls for a long moment before answering. Not because the answer was difficult, but because the question deserved the consideration of a man who was being asked something real by a person who intended to carry the answer forward into a life of work. You listen, he had said. The machine tells you. You just have to stop talking long enough to hear it. He had not known, giving that answer, that he was giving his son the most essential thing he had to give him. Not the specific technical knowledge Daniel had that, or would have it, or was in the process of building it with his own hands on his own mornings. The method of the knowledge. The understanding that the relationship between a person and the machines they work with is a relationship with real obligations on both sides, and that the machines, in the way of machines, respond to being listened to the way anything with a nature responds to being understood. You don't get more from a machine by asking more of it. You get more by understanding more about it. You get the most by treating it as something with a nature worth knowing rather than a system to be operated. Daniel had taken that answer and built something extraordinary with it. He had become the better engineer, the one with the finer ear, the one who could hear what was wrong before the instruments confirmed it. Earl had been proud of it with the specific uncompetitive pride that a person feels watching something they helped begin become something larger than what they began. A pride that has nothing of rivalry in it, only the pure satisfaction of watching inheritance produce its fruit. And then the coupling had failed on a line outside Helena in October of 2003, and the fruit had been taken. Earl stood in the quiet barn and let the grief sit in him without managing it, without shortening it, or redirecting it, or making it into something more bearable than it actually was. He did this sometimes, particularly in the mornings, particularly in this barn, because the grief was true, and he believed that true things deserve to be held fully rather than abbreviated. But this morning the grief sat differently than it usually did. It was the same grief he was not going to claim that a single afternoon on a mountain had changed the fundamental nature of a loss that had occupied 23 years. But it sat alongside something else that had not been there before, or had not been accessible before, a sense of having done something that the loss had been trying for 23 years to prevent him from doing. A sense of having come back, not to the rails, or to the work, or to any of the things that the loss had taken, but to the knowledge itself, to the thing that the rails and the work had been built on, the thing that was prior to all of it, and that the loss had not, as it turned out, been able to reach. The knowledge was still his. He had used it yesterday. He had used it in the only way that mattered to do something that needed doing without asking for anything in return. He thought Daniel would have understood exactly what happened yesterday. He would have understood the wheel lock, and he would have understood the transfer rig, and he would have understood the cutoff valve adjustment, and the pulse throttle application, and every technical element of what had been done. But more than that, he would have understood the thing underneath the technical elements. The listening, the patience, the decision to work with the metal's nature rather than against it. He would have nodded with that particular nod of his. Earl thought that was enough. He thought it was, in fact, quite a great deal. He took his hand from the steam valve. He looked at the engine for a long moment, at all of her, the full length of her, the boiler and the smoke box and the drive wheels and the worn brass trim and the operator's seat where he had sat yesterday for the first time in 31 years. The seat where his son had sat 30 years before that. the seat where he himself had sat for 19 years of working mornings on the Rocky Pass line. He reached down and picked up the folded canvas from the hay bale. He spread it over the engine slowly and with full care, beginning at the front, working toward the rear, tucking the edges with the patient thoroughness of someone covering something that deserves to be covered. Well, not quickly, not approximately, but well. Across the smoke box and the main boiler, across the firebox door and the drive wheel housings, across the running boards and the operator's platform. Until she was covered completely and only the shape of her remained beneath the canvas, solid and unmistakable, the shape of something that has worked hard and earned its rest. He straightened up and stood looking at her shape beneath the canvas. The barn was very still. The hawk was still circling outside over the backfield. The morning light coming through the open doors was still the thin gray of pre-dawn, not yet committed to the day. He spoke very softly to no one and to someone. "Good girl." He stood for a moment longer, then he walked to the barn doors and stepped out into the cold morning, pulling them shut behind him with the care of someone closing, something that deserves to be closed carefully. He stood in the yard for a moment with his hands in his pockets looking at the mountains. The way he looked at them every morning, not with longing, not with regret, not with the complicated weight of a man reviewing what he has lost, with the simple, clear attention of a man looking at something that has always been true, and that will be true long after he is gone. The sky was full blue now over the eastern ridge. The dawn completed the day committed to itself. He walked back to the farmhouse. In the kitchen, his coffee was still warm. He sat at the table and drank it slowly in the quiet of the morning, with the mountains visible through the window, doing what they always did, and the day doing what days do, beginning simply as itself, and he was at peace with where he was, and at peace with where he had been, and at peace as much as a man can be at peace with such things, with everything that lived in the space between those two places. Some knowledge does not announce itself. It does not compete with louder answers, or argue its case against the confidence of newer methods, or insist on being consulted before it has been invited. It waits quiet and patient and entirely intact in old barns and long silences, and in the hands and the memory of men who learned it in the only way that genuine knowledge is learned, slowly, honestly, through years of attentive work, through the accumulated instruction of machines that tell you the truth about what they need if you will stop talking long enough to hear it. And sometimes on a mountain road in the early morning when 19 vehicles have failed and the experts have delivered their assessments, and the institutional confidence of the recovery operation has gone quiet with its broken equipment and its honest exhaustion, sometimes the knowledge gets out of the truck. It walks toward the problem. It asks for 4 hours, and then it listens.